registered outside. This is for us to produce your certificates. So each attendee should receive 2 certificates, one from the joint programs and the second from Oxford. Okay, next on the agenda, our second session, we'll start now at 6, well it's a bit late, up to 6:30. Teaching medical reading presented by King Khalid University. Please put your hands together for Dr. Ali Rio.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody that is here to listen to these talks and to the organizing committee for this opportunity to share with colleagues from the university and also with colleagues from the Oxford Press. We're very grateful. So what I'm going to try to do today is to share with you the experience we have teaching reading to medical students in the preparatory year program at King Khalid University. I will give a little bit of background into what kind of students we have, what is the course we do, just to have a broad spectrum of the things that we encounter in our teachings. So we teach at King Khalid University Mahala Campus program ESL using a communicative approach, and this is the spread of the classes we teach. We teach 3 different types of students. So fresh students that come from engineering, we call it the 011 classes. The 012 are students that advance from this fresh to a second semester, and the 019, which are the medical students, which is going to be the focus today. So we teach 4 languages skills: grammar, writing, listening, and reading. We don't do much speaking, just because of the time constraints. And one key issue that we face, a challenge we face, is that the level of the English language ranges from very basic to a very good upper intermediate level. So we have students from very basic to upper intermediate. In the 019 classes, which are the medical students, as I mentioned, we have different levels of English. Now, I have to say that the medical students are probably the best students for English, and perhaps for other subjects as well. But the level of English compared to the other classes is substantially higher. Nevertheless, we have, and this is empiric assessment, because we haven't done a proper placement exam, but by knowing the students already in 1 year, in the 2 semesters that I have been here, we have about 20% which have very basic level of English. About 30% a lower intermediate, 30% a middle intermediate, and 20% upper intermediate. Now, another challenge we face is that the class size is quite large. It's at least 40 students. So we can spread this in numbers like this. Around 8 students have a very basic level of English. And then so on 12 lower intermediate, 12 students a middle intermediate level, 8 students an upper intermediate. We don't have students that are at the advanced level yet. And because of the class size, the most we can really realistically hope for is to shift this arrow or this level from the basics to the lower and so on and so forth. So at the end of the semester, we want to have moved our students at least 1 step up in their skills for learning. Now, the book we use is a very good but very challenging book. I mean, Terry has come here and told us about teaching reading to medical students, and it is a really good book because it encourages students. However, it is challenging because the vocabulary is for professional people. So it's for doctors that have already finished their degree and they already have a good background on the different subject areas that are discussed in that textbook. So the book is really English for specific purposes. However, having said that, we can really use this book in our classes to encourage students not only to learn English, but to learn it in a way that they will understand some medical terminology, which at the end is something that they really are looking forward to do. So, a challenge is that a lot of the vocabulary we see in the textbooks is even new for us teachers. We encounter this new vocabulary which we have to prepare. Of course, with internet these days, it's not such a difficult task. Nevertheless, we have to really prepare the vocabulary to teach students the text, how to read and how to understand them. Because a lot of this vocabulary is very critical. So, the challenge really comes when we have to explain this vocabulary to students, not only to teach how to read and comprehend the text, but actually to understand where they are reading the vocabulary that enrich their learning experience. So, because it's a challenging subject, we cannot really teach all the students at the same level. However, the quality of the students in our medicine classes is really good. And the ones whose English is low, they are eager to learn. They are quite disciplined students, I have to say, at KKU. We are actually really pleased with the way they come to classes and they engage in classes, and we have, obviously, to help them integrate into all the learning activities. So perhaps this is their first encounter with a subject they are also very eager to learn, which is medicine. And that makes them more motivated. So how do we really motivate them? So what we as teachers bring into the classroom to encourage and stimulate the learning process? What practical strategies can we use? So what I'm going to talk now is about particularly personal experiences, but I think most of us in our careers have done things similar or different but reaching the same end. So what we bring during our studies, all of us, and working experience, have acquired a set of skills. We have refined it during the years, we have replaced it, and we even continue to develop it. So we refine, reduce, and replace whenever it's necessary to maximize a student learning experience. So the 3 R's, whether we know it or not, we do it all the time. I'm pretty sure of that. So it is well established that spending time explaining new vocabulary before and after each lesson helps the student to understand what is the lesson about, but also motivates them because they realize they are learning new vocabulary and at the same time they are learning English. The vocabulary they are learning in these classes is specific for what they are going to do in the future, which is to study medicine. Medical terminology, as with any specific terminology, is better learned using the technique of word building and not boring memorization. So it's not just good to translate a word or to tell them the meaning of a concept or a word. It is better if they understand the root of the words and they can build it up. So, to teach vocabulary, it is best to break new words into key root components. The students will learn it more easily, and they will also relate it to other words that have similar roots. I will give some examples in a minute. One thing I like to stress out is that we all know that most specific terminology in the medical sciences come from the Greek and the Latin. And it is useful for the students to know that, because then we are going to be able to break the words down into the components that they will find in many places. So the terminology for specific studies come from the Greek. I will give some examples in a minute. And all the anatomical terminology come from the Latin. So when we talk about the heart in Latin is cor, and in English has become core, and heart in Greek is cardia, which in English has become cardio. So you already know where it comes from. You tell that to a student and they will know already where it comes from. In English, the word core is being used commonly in many things. For example, the Earth's core, the root core, we use core all the time, and it means heart, comes from the Greek. So by telling the students that heart can be core in Latin or cardio in Greek, they will already know a lot of words they may have heard which have the root cause, the root of the word is heart. So they will be able to relate that to this. And they will associate heart with all these situations which they have heard this, like cardio exercises, for example, and other things. So following with these examples, but we can use any specialty terminology to do this, we can go on to explain a family of related words, nouns and adjectives. Okay, we can say cardiovascular. We break it down into cardio. They already know it is heart. And then we add the word vascular. And we explain that vascular is the vasculature, which are all the blood vessels, all the veins and arteries in the body. So we know cardiovascular is related to the heart and all the blood vessels. So this simple explanation already prepares them to know when something is related to blood vessels, arteries and veins, and the heart. And we can continue to say, okay, cardiology. They may have heard what is cardiology, but if we break it down again, we say cardio is heart, and logy means the study of. This is what it means from the Greek. And therefore, this is a specific subject or the specific study of the heart. So cardiology is the science that studies the heart and the cardiovascular system. Then we can go on and say cardiologist. And you see it's just a slight changing in the end. Logi comes from exchanges for logist. And a cardiologist, if we explain what it means, logist is the person who has studied. Sorry, there is a spelling mistake there. We all make mistakes. I apologize for it. So the person who has studied any subject that ends in logist, that would be the specialist in the area. So cardiologist is a person that has studied the heart or the cardiovascular system. And that is the same with a lot of the vocabulary we will find in teaching medicine, reading. Bio is life. Biology, students will already know that is a study of life, and the biologist will be the person that study biology or that study life. Pharmaco, in Greek, or pharmakon, means medicine. Pharmacology will be the study of medicines as drugs, and the pharmacologist will be the person that studies pharmacology, the specialist. So we can build up all the vocabulary that is necessary there. And we can see in the text, we have texts about gastroenterology, we have texts about neurology, we have texts about psychology. So all these we can actually help students bring it up, build up the words, break it down, adjective and nouns, to understand what it really means. So, this is the last couple of slides. So the vocabulary, when we use the word building from the root up, and we utilize this type of approach, students, if they find the sentence cardiovascular disease in a text, they would know what the word disease is, and they will already know what cardiovascular means, and then they will know that it is a disease of the heart and or blood vessels. Cardiovascular diseases, that is what they are. But they will also know that the specialty that studies these diseases will be cardiology, and that the doctor or the person, a specialist to study this type of disease, is a cardiologist. So by breaking down 2 or 3 words, we're building up in their vocabulary, but not only the actual terminology, but bring it up what other terminology may come about. So students will actually learn from one word other words. So to summarize this experience in teaching reading English to medical students is that English should be presented in authentic context, practical context, so that the students can learn, can be inquired with the particular ways the language is used in functions that they will need to perform in their specialty fields. These students are going to study medicines, the ones I'm describing just now. So anything related to medicine, they would feel eager to learn. So they are learning English, but they are learning a little bit of medicine. And they actually respond that very well. And I assure you that's the same way for for teaching English for specific purposes. So motivated learners pay attention to the meaning of the language they hear or read and do not focus primarily on the linguistic input or isolated language structure. And this is very important to really capitalize on this communicative approach of learning. The teacher. So the teacher role in the classroom is obviously to organize learning programs in the context of what they are going to teach, set out the goals and objectives, establish a positive learning environment that is to motivate the students, evaluate the students' progress and what the students bring to the classes, focus for learning, and adult learning strategies. These are young students, but they are quite adult already, so they have acquired some adult learning strategies. They are in between school and university level. So sometimes we have to teach them a little bit of feeding up things, but we can elicit a lot from them. So they have these learning strategies acquired that shows they are quite adult because they are very engaging. So we can actually elicit a lot from them. Well, thank you. That's my time up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alirio. The final topic for this evening is teaching, listening, and assessment, presented by Zaid Ben Haman. Sorry, I was wrong. Terry.
Sorry, it's me again. Thanks. Actually, we're both going to do a little bit on listening. Let me just sort the slides out for you. I'm doing a bob.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alirio, for the session. It's very interesting. I'd just like to point out here that based on what I saw on one of the slides, I'm going to arrange for the teacher's books for the medicine series to be sent to Dr. Muwaffaq. So you should have them very shortly. Now I feel that you should be up here and I should be sitting down there.
Okay. Just before we get on to the next topic this evening of listening, as I say, I'm going to share some of the slides with my colleague Zaid. Just to let you know, though, that I'll be making all of these slides available to you. So what I'll do is email them to Dr. Monami, and he can, in whatever way you share materials, but he can share the slides with you. So someone was mentioning there wasn't a lot on assessment for writing. I'll give you those slides because I do have criteria on assessing things or correcting things other than grammar and vocab and correction codes and that kind of thing. It doesn't need a lot of explanation, so you can probably follow it just from the slides. Okay, so we're moving on to listening. And what I would like to do first of all is for you to think about, work in pairs, and I'd like you to write a list of all the things that you have listened to in the last 24 hours. So, for example, I listened to the news on TV last night, and I listened to when my flight was going to be landing when I was on the plane yesterday. Those are a couple of things that I listened to. With a partner, can you make a list of all the things you've listened to, probably in the last 12 hours, actually, if you think about sleep and everything? So make sure you number the list, because you're going to refer back to it later. You can listen to sounds as well as language. You might have heard the kettle boiling. That has some meaning to you. Okay, so you should have a list of about 4 or 5 things that you've listened to over the last 12 to 24 hours. Now I'd like you to go back. Think about your list, and decide which listening experience involved the following. So if you've numbered your list, you can match these to your list. And think about the different ways that we listen. I'll let you read through those and match them to how you've been listening. So, how many of the ways you listened involved actually listening to somebody physically talking to you face to face? How many times have you done that in the last 12 hours? Ladies, probably more. Ladies are chattier. Good. Here, in this venue, yep, okay. How about, how much have you been required to listen closely and attentively? When I'm speaking, no. No, I'm joking, obviously. Yeah? Okay, all right. What kind of things do we listen to very closely? Really closely. Instructions, good. Are we able to listen very attentively and very closely for long periods of time? As native speakers even? Do some of the listenings in course books expect our students to do that? And it's odd, to be honest. You'll find a lot of listenings because we want our students to practice listening for specific information. So they're listening for numbers, or they're listening for times, and they're not actually very natural. So even if you're in a train station and you're listening for your time to come up for your train, or perhaps this is my biggest thing, at Jeddah Airport, listening for the gate for my flight. They change the gate all the time, but they don't put it on the screen. And I can't hear it but I'm only listening for one thing, a gate change. So very often in course books, course books for some reason require students to listen to a number of changes. And it's actually very difficult for them. Also, as this gentleman at the back says, as a native speaker, sometimes you play a listening and think, do you know what, I can't remember the beginning of that either. How are our students expected to do it? So I think we need to be quite careful about the listenings that we select and how we break them down for our students, and definitely the tasks that we choose to go with them. But what this illustrates, I think, is that listening is very varied. So it ranges from being interactive and non-interactive. What does it mean for our students when most of the listening they do is to the teacher or to another student, or to a listening that we play? How difficult is it when it's a listening that we play, if you know what I mean, a listening activity, not a video? Why would that be difficult for them? Listen to this and write down all the numbers you hear, or listen to this and answer the comprehension. The memory. And yeah, and if you think about it as well in terms of what we do naturally with listening, how many times do you put on the radio and think, right, I've got these comprehension questions to answer from this listening? It's not something we naturally do, although we require our students to do it. So this sort of listening to somebody without being able to see their face also is very difficult. And if you pick up the phone and I think, okay, that's my colleague Zaid calling, there's a number of things that go through my head before I even start talking to him. We've got the training in upper. Is he calling about the flight details? Is he asking me something to do? Already the context is there. It's not necessarily there for students. I think listening for our students is a lot more difficult than we realise. And with there being so many different types of listening. So this face-to-face or disembodied listening can be very difficult. Listening has varied purpose. It can be transactional. You're listening for pleasure. It can be conveying meaning. It can be intensive, like we've just talked about. Or we might simply be listening just to get the general idea of it. But there is a lot of different listening that we do, and we tend to do it very naturally, so our ears will tune in to the type of listening, because we've been doing it all our lives. We know how to tune into a radio play I'm listening to a lot of podcasts at the moment, and I've noticed I have to listen quite carefully at the beginning, but then as the play goes on, I've got the gist of what's going on, and I can do other things while it's on. So our students won't necessarily listen in the same way to another language, or they need help with it. So, as I've asked you before, and we've touched on some of this, can you make a list with the person next to you? What are the challenges of listening for our students? I've talked about some of them, it not being face-to-face, which is, I find that incredibly difficult. Especially if I'm talking to someone on the phone that I've never met before, or there's no context. So can you think of 4 challenges for students? Okay, so let me share my first one with you that one of the gentlemen mentioned here. The written language, especially in English, and the spoken language do not always correlate. They don't always connect at all. So students can be hearing something and trying to visualize what it is that they've heard in terms of print, and they can't make the connection because of connected speech and all these sort of ways of speaking we have. And it's not a phonetic language either, which doesn't help. What were some of the other challenges that you came up with for students? Accents, and somebody mentioned that here. I mean, even in the UK, if you were to just be operating in the UK, I have friends in the north of England that I really struggle to understand what they're saying, especially if we're in a restaurant and there's a lot of background noise. I've got absolutely no chance. And that's just in my country. So I think students really struggle with different accents, especially, and somebody mentioned it here, if they're not ready for it. If we don't prime them to say you're going to be listening to two females in a restaurant talking about. If they're not ready for that, then it's really tough for them. I think accents might have been the next one. I think my battery's running low here. Accents vary a lot. There you go. You read my mind. Weak forms and connected speech. We talked about that. And I'm going to show you some slides in a little bit that will, a little often, but that can help students get over some of the fear of connected speech. Often students want to translate. Now, we're talking... Oh, are you saying yes or no at the back there? She's going, oh, I thought she meant no. I think, you know, when students, certainly when I was learning Spanish, every time I listened, this was years ago, I wanted to understand what every word was. And when I heard every word, I was trying to think what it was in English. And I was an English teacher back then. I knew better, but the security blanket is that you want to hear everything. And students will try to translate, especially if they've used a translation method of learning English in high school or in school. They may have been doing quite a lot of translation then. So that's what they're bringing to the classroom. It's what they're used to. There are not always visual aids for them. So, of course, when we're prepping our students, we talked, you've got to get them ready to listen, ready to read, ready to write. In the real world, they don't always have a visualization to help them. And that can be really difficult. Background noise can have a big effect on making listening difficult. We talked about that. And an inability to interact, and that's when an understanding can break down. So if you find you've set up speaking activities with your students, and in effect a speaking activity is a form of listening practice. If you're interacting with a partner, you've got to listen to them to be able to respond to them. But if you haven't heard what they've said and you don't have the time to respond, that's when communication can break down. And students don't often want to respond if they don't feel like they've understood what's been said. So that can be an issue as well. And that's what I talked about just then, the pressure to speak as well as listen. Topics may be unfamiliar. So we get our students ready to read by familiarising them with a topic. But if they don't have that familiarisation, it can be difficult. And it can just feel like there is too much information. And as I said, a lot of course books expect students to deal with a lot of information in one listening, which isn't always very natural. Okay, I am going to read two texts to you, and I'm going to lose power on my computer soon. Is there any way of plugging this in? It just keeps coming up that we're almost out of power. I'm going to read a text to you, and I would like you to tell me what the text is about. This is a listening activity for you. You don't have, this is terrible because I should give you a task for gist and not just say, what do you think it's about? But you're native speaker level, so that's fine. Okay, are you ready? Tell me what the text, or, I know, your gist is, think of the title of the text. Before they start, conditions are less than ideal and security is at risk. But the problem is soon resolved at each of their adjacent arms as they repeatedly describe the same short arc, the one in time with the other. In this way, the impediment is removed, thus avoiding the need to stop and perform the operation by hand. The process continues until such time as a change in conditions renders it unnecessary. Any idea what I'm talking about? No. Think about what the problem is. Oh, good. Well done. All right, listen to the next text. We sat down at the table in the corner and the 4B took our order. To start with, Therese ordered humble and I had a green diblet. For the main course, Therese went for the pan-fried lunk with a fitch-bitch sauce. And I opted for the house speciality, a shoulder of roast chorton. We washed all of this down with a bottle of ice-cold Jimmery. Think about the second text. Think about the first text. What were the problems of understanding the first one? And what were the problems or not problems of understanding the second one? Very quickly, talk to your partner. I'll give you a minute. I always say a minute. What would you need in the first one to help you understand it better? Good. So in order to process information, we're thinking about listening here, what do you need for the first text and what do you need for the second text? The first text you talked about you need a situation, you need some background. What about the second text? So in terms of, I think most of you are aware of these terms, but in terms of processing, what am I talking about? And bottom up. Good, okay. Oh, I haven't got my clicker now. So reading out the first text, you listening to the first text, what did you lack? Bottom up or top down? Good, all right. And the second text was, so let's have a look at top down and bottom ups. Most of you seem to be familiar with it. So, top down processing, bottom up processing, a bit of both. I'd like you to think of a sort of definition. What do we mean by top-down processing and what do we mean by bottom-up processing? What's the difference between the two? I've given you an example of the texts. Just together, think of the differences. Discuss together. Discuss together. So, I think most of you are on the same page with this. So your top-down processing is the bigger picture. So if you remember, the first text I read out to you was actually a text about windscreen wipers. So somebody mentioned weather, so you clocked onto that. But if I'd said to you, you're going to hear something about how windscreen wipers work, immediately you bring your background knowledge to that listening. You know what a windscreen wiper is. You know it's in a car or a vehicle. You know it's a mechanism that you don't use with your hands. You know about it because this is the life experience you bring to that task. So if I'd said windscreen wipers, you would have had no problem with that listening. But you weren't given any background information, and although all the words were in English and you can understand the individual words, you weren't able to make sense of it because it didn't help you with any background knowledge. And that's what titles and headings are for. They direct you to what you're about to hear. Impossible without it. And your bottom-up processing is the individual blocks of language. So if you think about the second text I read out, you understood that, where was I? In a restaurant, or the people were in a restaurant, they were ordering food. It was a roast something. It could have been lamb, it could have been beef, it could have been chicken. You didn't have that language to know what it was. So these are the two things, the bit of both, I've answered your question there, the bit that our students need to be able to process listening. They need top down, they need a background, but they also need the language. So these are the two things that need to come together for them to be able to deal with listening. So, when we're talking about top-down processing, we are thinking about brainstorming ideas, and you might be using a visual. Generally speaking, from the and I do a lot of observing in schools and universities in Saudi, this is something that teachers are very good at. They're very good at getting their students ready to read, to visualize, and to bring their students' experience of life to the task. And sometimes having to fill in the gaps, because our students are quite young. They don't always have a lot of knowledge on the topic. Teachers here generally tend to be very good at getting students ready with brainstorming. Students can be predicting content from that visual. They can be predicting a title. This whole idea of activating schemata is the fancy name, the fancy teaching name they use for it. You're basically activating knowledge that's already there. But if you don't do that, students go in cold. So you went cold into that listening, and it was very difficult for you to work out what it was all about. Students might order visuals. They might order actual text or prose into a sequence of events. So this idea of actually using information and doing something with it before they listen. They can list what they know and what they want to find out. This is one of my favourite ones. So students think, or they share together the information they already have. What information do they find out? And then at the end of it, they can go back and check if the listening filled in any of the gaps that they have. They might make up an ending as well for a listening. Anything that directs them towards the content and gets them actually thinking about it. And something that we all do, I hope we all do, is get our students to answer gist questions. Very quickly, what do we mean by that? Yeah, the general idea. Again, I know I do a lot of evaluative observations as well, and I find that writing gist questions are actually much more difficult than writing comprehension questions. To write a really good gist question that actually tests have they understood overall meaning and not more detailed meaning is not an easy thing to do. What I also find with less experienced teachers is just listen to the following conversation and understand it. That's not a task. You really need to direct students. They always need to have something to listen for. If not, they drift in the same way that we drift, because they're not listening for anything in particular. That's how, as professionals, we need to help them. So our bottom-up, pre-teaching vocabulary. Can anyone else give me some ideas about how we can help students in terms of bottom-up, i.e. language blocks? Silence. Okay, in terms of language. Okay. Good, nice. Collocations. Yeah. Yep. They might predict tenses. So when you're asking them to predict ideas from a title, that's the kind of top down. But bottom up, you might think, well, I'm going to tell you about when I went out for dinner last night. What tense am I going to use? What tense do you expect to hear? What you're doing is focusing on the language. So the idea is, with bottom up, you focus on the language. They might do a reading race, so where they specifically focus on language and transfer it to a partner. You might ask them to count the words, and we're going to do that in a second. Dictogloss we've already looked at today, so dictogloss is listening as well. And dictation of weak forms. So, I want to focus on that a little bit. And some problems that your students might be having with connected speech, and we're probably talking lower levels, but I think this is when the confidence is low with students. So I would like you to tell me what word you can hear. Listen. Can you take a piece of paper and write down the word that you've just heard? Write down the word. Write down the word. You already. No, I said write the word. That's my teacher's face. I did. The word. That was good timing, wasn't it? What? I'm asking for a word. Not a sound, a word. I've lost the battery there. If you've heard the sound E-R-E. They are playing. You say okay. If you've heard the sound what word is that? Or what letter is that? If you said that to your students, what would you expect them to say? Okay. Now listen, and you're right. A bottle of water. So what word did I say? What word is it? Thank you, someone said it. Oh. The lower level students are going to get in a lot of it. Yes, it's the schwa, yeah. We know all of that. I'm talking about what your students will hear. And they hear this a lot. Now for us, it's a walk in the park. It's it's oh. No, we know that. But for them, they get caught up in we said at the beginning, bottle, water. Why does it say water? So listen to, in fact, I'm going to read some out to you. Okay, you haven't got a picture for this one. It's not working. It's going. Okay, listen again. I should have got up earlier. What's the word? Have. I should have got up earlier. I should have got. Your students. Your students are are just going to hear again. And what they think is is a. It's the letter a. So with this connected speech, there's a lot of misunderstanding for students. And the problem is, for lower levels, for you, you'll just wait for the next sentence to come and you'll pick it up. Because you've got the context, you've got the experience, you've got the confidence. When we don't hear a few sounds, it doesn't bother us. We're in conversation, we'll get it. But like I was saying, when I was learning Spanish, and Spanish can be incredibly fast when you're first hearing it. And a whole sentence sounds like one word. Thank you very much. A whole sentence can sound like one word. And suddenly, I thought my Spanish was fairly good. In a conversation, I lost all my confidence because I was trying to understand what each word was. So here's another one. Are you coming for coffee? So what's the word? Again, students don't hear that when we say it. Now, most students will be able to pick that up from the context. And it's pretty obvious when you're in a conversation. If you can understand coming and coffee, you're halfway there. And that's all we need. We only need small sounds to work the context out. Students without the confidence to do that will just reject it. And that's some of the problems that students have with listening as well, is with connected speech. So I should have got up early. Are you coming for a coffee? Have a look at this and tell me, what is the English? I separated the words out to make them real words. But I don't think any of your students are going to hear that sentence and put the words together like that. But even if they misunderstand a couple of the words and think it completely throws them. And if they're in a conversation where they're listening, because you're absolutely right, I'm ill, but I'll meet her next week. But if they're in a conversation and they hear, I'm ill, and I'm ill is easy to misunderstand, then the rest of the words that come after that, they don't have the confidence to process it. Not only that, but if they're in a conversation, they're being expected to contribute to that conversation, all the understanding and the conversation itself will break down. What we can do with students, and I know the idea of dictation is very unpopular because it's a very old-fashioned thing, but we can with our students do a little bit of dictation. So, for example, where are you from? If you ask your students to write that down, there's a good chance, unless they're super beginners, that they'll be able to work that out from context. But they could also have a go at, could I have a bit of butter? Could I have a bit of butter? Easy for you to do, but it's a short chunk of language. If you ask your students to write that down, not to worry too much about spelling, but it gets them to think about the words, how they sound, and what they look like. Another one. My sister's got a terrible teacher. She doesn't teach her anything. Try that with your students. I'm not suggesting that you do a lot of this. Just stop sometimes and do it with them a little often, and you'll get them to realise that what they're hearing and what they see, there is a disconnect, but don't be scared of it. You can deal with it. So a little dictation often will help as well. Another one to do is how many words. So Okay. Can you tell me how many words in this one? I suppose we'll just have to wait and see. I suppose we'll just have to wait and see. So if you ask your students to take the contractions and make them into separate words, you would have 10. But sometimes it's a good idea to just read the sentence out and get them to think about how many words that actually is. Again, I wouldn't do it all the time, but just sometimes it gets students to realise that the sound and what words look like are very different. And often they're quite surprised by it too. So, we talked about some of the challenges that students have and some small things you can do to help them with what words sound like or what chunks of language sound like and what they look like. I'd like you to have a look at a listening lesson, just so that we bring it into the classroom. And think about what order you would do this lesson in. So we talked about our top-down processing, the bottom-up processing. This is a mixture of the two. Work together and put it in order. Okay, did you agree with your partner? I think there are different possibilities, but that's the logical order I came up with. Would you disagree with any of that, gentlemen? So normally you disagree. The order? It's only my order. It's not the correct order. Must be right then.
And then E. But then I would put A. I would, because maybe the grammar isn't very good enough. So I would put A after that.
Okay.
It's also grammar and vocabulary.
But would you agree with D, E, and F? I think you've got to deal with a gist task, haven't you, before you get into any detail. One question that came up with the ladies that is an interesting one. How many times do you play the listening? How many times do you let them listen? You say the first time to listen to it. To listen to what? Okay, so we're agreed that you set a gist task, though. Okay, 3 times? Always 3 times. I think you're all coming up with the point that I'm trying to make, and that is vary it. The big mistake I made when I started teaching was I thought I was helping my students by letting them listen to it as many times as they needed. If you need to listen to it again, that's fine, you listen to it again. But of course, that was when I started to learn Spanish, because I could hear one girl saying, you don't have to listen, she plays it again. So when your students get used to you playing it too many times, they switch off the first time. I vary it. So when I find that the listening itself is super easy for these students, you're hearing it once. As long as they know they're only going to hear it once. This is below your level or at your level, you should be able to manage it. In life, you only get one chance, generally speaking, unless you're going to say, sorry. So I think it's important to vary it. But also there's another interesting point that this gentleman brought up as well. How do you make use of transcripts? So the transcript of the listening, the actual written form of the listening, what do you do with that? Do you do anything with it? Okay. Yeah, I think the advantage of the transcript is it allows them to make the connection between the way the language sounds and the way that it looks. But like you say, a lot of people say don't use transcripts because in real life they're not going to see it.
Well, the thing is, Larry, I see it when we were children and our parents taught read fairy tales to us, or when we had some kind of reading, like someone would stand in front of the class and read, we would follow. So we have that kind of experience from our childhood. They don't. So it's unfair to deprive them of it, you know?
Okay, yeah.
So it doesn't mean that if you're listening to have to need to use the transcript, but it has to be part of at least one task. Okay, listen to it. Now, guys, let's follow with your eye.
So it's a different task that maybe we would do, not always, but it's I think when I've used it, and we were talking about this, when I've used it with beginners really struggle with listening. It's a long time for them to listen and understand. And then it feels like at the end of all the tasks, you give them the transcript at the end and they might do something with it, and there's this kind of sigh of relief. They get the transcripts like, yeah, I understand it now. It's a little it's a sort of aid to just help them to realise that they've understood everything. Again, I don't use it all the time, but I think for beginners it's very useful. And they often ask for it as well. Students will often ask for it. And if you ask students to do independent listening, they always use a transcript, always. So it is something that makes them feel more confident. Okay, so talking about sourcing listening practice, we've talked about lessons, we've talked about what students find difficult and what they need. Obviously, our first port of call is going to be a course book. The course books should have graded listening at the student's level, and you know, when it's in the course book, you haven't got to go away and look for it. And that's the thing with listening. If you're going to make your own listening, that can take a long time. And if you want to record a conversation, that can take a long time. So I think use course books. Use students as a resource as well. So speaking and listening activities, tell your partner. One thing about using the students, because obviously when they're involved in a dialogue, they're listening and they're responding. What's a disadvantage of that? Okay, if they're not speaking in Arabic. Isn't that great listening practice? I think pronunciation is an issue. I think mistakes can be an issue as well. I'm not saying don't use students as listening practice. Some students that feel they need to understand every word and then that word doesn't get corrected often get confused. Like, he made a mistake, why aren't you correcting? Also, what I see a lot of that doesn't work is tell your partner. Does the partner listen? Okay, but they're working in pairs, and you say, all right, we've done a lot of work on vocabulary on the restaurant last night. I want you to tell your partner about going to the restaurant last night. Does the partner listen? They don't listen. And it's not, and I've observed a lot of it, it's not a slight on that person. I'm not criticising that student, but they don't need to know why he went to the restaurant last night. It's not new news. He knows he's going to talk about what he ordered. He pretty much knows what's coming. He doesn't need that information to get home tonight or do his homework. What you need to do is give the listener a task. That's what's so important. And that's what I see. A lot of teachers who are busy, they just forget to say and write down 4 food words that you hear. Something like that. Otherwise, they're not going to listen. And also, you get students thinking, my English is better than his, I'm not going to listen to this rubbish. You do get that, unfortunately. So it's really important when students are working together, for this guy to get something out of it, he needs something to listen for. Just a little task, that's all. Students can listen to radio, students can listen to podcasts, students can watch TV. What's the issue with saying to your students, go away, watch BBC, here's a great podcast from the BBC? Yeah. Yep, exactly. When you ask students to choose from an authentic source, it's often way above their head. They'll go for a topic that they're interested in, but it's not at a level that they can manage. Also, why? Again, why go away and listen to the news? Why go and listen to this podcast? Where's the task? If you get students to do authentic listening, they drift, because you haven't given them anything to listen for. And that's part of the problem. There's a ton of really good stuff that I'm going to show you in a second on the internet that nowadays, that I never had because I started teaching 100 years ago, they've got loads of really good stuff on the internet now that's graded with tasks. You need to direct your students towards that, because they don't know where to find this stuff. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but don't just let them go and listen to authentic material without either a task or a site where it's graded or some kind of topic that they can manage. That's the issue with students choosing. We are now going to talk a little bit about online listening practice, which is my colleague Zaid's area. So I'm going to pass over to him. Thanks, Zaid.
Thank you, Terry. First of all, for those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Zaid bin Hamid and I work with Terry at Oxford University Press. My role is an educational consultant. It may sound fancy, but it's not. I also do online platforms. What I do with that is training, solutions, and technical support, and that's my area of specialty. You may have seen from the schedule that tomorrow's session is on the effective use of online practice and the benefits to the learner. So that means today I'm not going to go in too deep. I'm also aware of the time, and it's the end of a cold, dark Friday, so I'll hopefully take no more than 10 minutes. So part of the resources that you can use as a teacher with your students is online practice. And as opposed to designing your own materials or finding authentic sources, online practice usually comes with the course book. In fact, it almost always does. And this is something that you see from most of the big publishers, especially Oxford University Press. So what I want to do is just show you a sort of an example of a little bit from the new Headway online practice that we have, and ways that you can use this with your students, or you could potentially use this with your students. So this is an activity. I'm not sure of the level that this is from, but I think it's from the elementary book. And as you can see, the activity is a listening activity, where students would listen or they would read, depending on the task you give them. Here they have to fill in the 10 sentences with the words that are provided above. Now, just real quickly, from a teacher's perspective, what are some of the benefits that you would get when your students use an activity like this? What do you think, from a teacher's view, this would be? How would this help you? Sorry? Yes, it's structured and it's pre-prepared for you. Okay, do you have to mark it? Do you think you have to mark it after students have completed the activity? No, it's automatically marked. Yeah, it's an online practice. Sorry if I didn't mention that. Is this linked to what you're teaching in class? Would this be linked to the level and the course book and the content of the unit? Yes. Do students have to do this when you're there with them? No. So another benefit is students get to do it as further practice at a time that's suitable for themselves. So what usually happens, and I'm not going to bore you with the technical details of how students would get access to something like this, but once a student has an account and they go onto this particular unit, they click on this activity, they would then, depending on the LMS, the learning management system, they would either type in the word or they would drag and drop. And so this is, I don't know who answered this, but this is one of my colleagues' answers to the questions. So before I click the next slide, are these correct?
Number 9 is incorrect. Number 9 is incorrect.
Okay, so one of your colleagues mentioned that number 9 is incorrect, and that's right. I think the answer is start a conversation. So what you would do here is, or the student would do, they would have the opportunity to review their answers before they submitted the activity. And this works very well with students who have problems with confidence, or they usually need a little bit more time. Especially if you have a mixed ability classroom. This is something that your colleague sort of mentioned in his talk earlier. If you have students, weaker students, and they need more time to process, then this is a really good opportunity for them to do so. So once they've attempted all of the answers, they would not click on check answers, they would click on submit, or check, in this case, check answers, and the system would then come back to them with an automatically marked feedback, basically. And here the student is able to see at a first glance where he or she went wrong. Now, some systems give the students an opportunity to repeat the activity as many times as they like, with the grade being the final attempt. That means they could make a mistake and, for a first time, a second time, a third time, and if they get it right the fourth time, then that's the mark that is in their that is in the grade book. Other systems take the first grade, but give the the student the opportunity to carry on practicing. And they would try again, and then eventually they would be able to see the answers. This is another example of select the correct answer. So a student would listen. Again, here the student would be able to pause the listening activity, which is something they couldn't do if they were in a classroom. They're able to pause and repeat, increase the volume, etc. Okay. So I know we mentioned some of these. How do you think this could help you in your daily teaching? Any other ideas than what we already mentioned?
I just want to add one more thing. There is a program called text to speech. So a lot of the time, they have a text to read. They could just pop into that window and listen to either a lady or a man read it, and then they could choose actual speech. So that's also one thing that I've used to teach listening, because for them the text is very dry. They pop it in, and then there's a lady that starts talking. Now you have a very authentic voice. Before it was everyone walking like that, and now you can't even tell them apart from the real voice. So that's another one that we use.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Using a text-to-speech software. So these are some of the ones that I have. It's pre-prepared for you, so no extra work for the teachers. It's very motivating, and I'm going to go into this in more detail tomorrow, and how it's motivating for the students. But it's motivating in the term that it gives them the opportunity to practice and to increase their confidence. It provides additional discussion, and here this is part of a learning management system where students can interact with the teacher or interact with each other. It's stimulating and based on authentic material. There's a variation of activities here, and as you mentioned, different voices as well. So the system would have a number of different voices, different accents as well for the students to focus on. Did you want to talk about these, Terry? These are the resources that Terry mentioned earlier.
Yeah, these are the online resources. As I say, I'll make these slides available. I'm not going to go, we haven't really got time to kind of go online and have a look at these. These are the 3 best ones that are graded, and these are the ones that I use all the time. And they have lots and lots of activities that students can do with it. Again, you're not sending students away, just listen to this, because it focuses them. What this kind of thing does require, I think, is it requires some self-awareness from your students, because we all know we can suggest things, but do our students actually go away and do it? So I think it needs some setting up as well. So often I will pull this up in the classroom to begin with and go through some of the websites with the students in the classroom and show them what it is that they can do. When there are students who are particularly weak in listening, once you've already set this up and shown them the possibilities, you can go away and say to them, you know, quietly, you need to go away and use that hello I told you about. You know, I know you're struggling a bit with your listening, but there are resources out there. So I think in terms of getting students to be more responsible for improving as well, this extra online practice is really useful. Personally, I think with listening, they need lots and lots of practice with it. And it's a huge jump for many students, as we mentioned before. Even just coming to your classes from having been at high school, it's a huge jump to just be having the whole lesson in English, just operating in English for that length of time. So the more practice they get, the better. It needs to be graded. And this does everything for you. So have a look at it yourself, set it up in the classroom, but these sites are really, really good for students. And when they've used it once and realised that there is material there that's at that level and that they can do and mark and grade themselves, the idea is that they're more motivated to go away and do it again because it's not too difficult for them. Okay, we're going to leave it there for today. As I say, we'll make all the slides available to you. And then tomorrow morning, we're going to start again at 6 o'clock in the morning here. Ah, you see, you were all listening then, though, weren't you? That was attentive listening.
A big thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to all of you for your participation. And tomorrow will be the second and final day of this workshop. We won't start at 6, we'll start at 9:30 sharp. 9:30. Yes. I'll see you tomorrow.